All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Craig Piercy, CEO of the American Nuclear Society. Welcome to Free the Economy, Craig.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Richard.
All right, now before we get started, I know people are excited. A lot of our listeners are excited about the themes of abundance, themes about energy and affordability, um, and the place that nuclear technology is going to have in that going forward. But why don't you give us a very quick elevator summary of what is the American Nuclear Society, what do you all do, and how did you come to lead such an august organization of experts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you for having me today. So, the American Nuclear Society is the scientific and professional society of the nuclear industry. So, we have 12,000 individual members, roughly 120 organizational partners, spread across utilities, suppliers, national labs, universities. So the ANS was actually created in 1954, shortly after President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, and it's focused on the civil applications of nuclear energy. So things that make people's lives better, things that provide us with abundance, and so like any professional society. We have conferences and journals and standards and a monthly magazine. But we also do a lot of work in classrooms and in K-12 education settings. We work in Washington, D.C. To provide policy engagement and support. And then we also work with media to promote a better general understanding of nuclear and its benefits. So I suppose that's how we find ourselves here today.
All right. So speaking of public understanding, I just saw some interesting poll results. So according to the Pew Research Center, about 60% of adults in the U.S. now say they favor building more nuclear power plants to generate electricity. And according to Pew, that's up from only 43% in 2020.
Mhm.
And we saw increases in support from both Democrats and Republicans. So is this shift in public opinion just in the past few years, is this part of a nuclear power renaissance?
Well, Renaissance. People like to use the term Renaissance. We've had a couple of those over the years. I think it's as much an enlightenment as it is a Renaissance. I
Mhm.
think people are beginning to develop a better appreciation for the challenges that we have with energy in both our country and the world, and the environmental consequences of getting that energy. And so I think we've seen broad bipartisan support. That support has maybe different flavors to it. You see folks that from the left side of the ideological spectrum tend to come to nuclear because they're trying to solve the climate challenge, and they
Right.
see nuclear as this reliable baseload source of energy that you probably need if you're going to have an energy system that's going to provide the abundance that everyone wants, but at a much lower carbon intensity. And then I think on and again, this is an oversimplification, but on the other side of the political spectrum, I think you see people that are focused really on energy security and the need for um, a robust energy grid that allows us to achieve the kind of economic growth that the country needs in order to support its continuing flourishing and hopefully have um, higher productivity that will lend itself favorably to solving some of the fiscal issues we have in the country and so forth. So I sort of sometimes describe it like the old Miller Lite commercials where half the room is chanting less filling and the other half is chanting tastes great.
Right. Yeah, the Trump team loves the phrase energy dominance. They
Mhm.
love they love the aggressive phrasing. So let's review a few of the major changes we've seen. So we've seen a lot of seems to me a lot of legislative action just in the past few years that have impacted where nuclear is heading. So we had going back to the Biden era, we had the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. So that included sort of tax subsidies for energy developers across the board, there's some nuclear parts, there was some energy, wind and solar parts. Um, and so I was actually at I think it was the 2023 ANS winter meeting that was here in Washington, D.C., and there was a great panel there about Congress and about policy with the two, at the time, the two West Virginia senators, Joe Manchin and Shelley Moore Capito,
Mhm.
and they were both talking about that. And of course, Joe Manchin had a big part in the Inflation Reduction Act. Um, what has the impact been there from IRA going forward? Now that we've had a few years since then, um, what impact has that had on your people?
Yeah, I think there's been a fairly consistent there's been fairly consistent progress in the policy over, say, the last 10 years. And you could take it all the way back to the first Trump administration and the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act, or NECA for short. That was a bill that authorized some reports, but it also authorized the development of a new research reactor, but it got 89 votes in the Senate. And so I think that woke everyone up to the fact that, wow, nuclear is this bipartisan thing. And then we saw it with the Nuclear Energy Innovation Modernization Act, NEMA. And then you had the IRA and the creation of the Advanced Reactor Development Program, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package first, which had the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and then the IRA that had the tax credits and other provisions in there. So I think there was this awakening in the beginning that nuclear was this bipartisan thing. It might not have been the way that we saw it a few decades ago. And then you've had a couple successive pushes on the bicycle seat, if you will, to really kind of get the new advanced nuclear industry going. And I think by every indication, we see that there is momentum to this. We see a number of nuclear reactor developers that have been stood up in the last 5 to 10 years, and you're really beginning to see those companies building order books and working on their designs, and so I think it's been the sum total of consistent policies over the years that supported nuclear has sort of propelled it forward to where it is today.
Well, yeah, and so like you said, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and then coming skipping forward a little bit, we had the what again seemed to me as as an outsider a big deal, the Advance Act. So that's Accelerating Deployment of Versatile Advanced Nuclear for Clean Energy Act. It seemed like a lot of the people in that world were really looking forward to that.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And I was just looking back to what sort of the reactions were at the time. And so, Senator Capito, who I think was the ranking member on the relevant committee at the time, um, there's a, quote from the press release when that was passed. She said, "Getting substantive bipartisan policy consensus across the finish line isn't always easy, but this is the result of years of hard work to build widespread consensus about the benefits of advanced nuclear reactors to our electricity grid, economy, and environment." And so that seems that, also like a sort of pushback on some of the kind of negative conventional wisdom, which is that, in our current era of Congress, everything is about
Mhm.
partisan sniping and getting sound bites for opposition ads, and that no one on Capitol Hill wants to do the real tough work of hammering out detailed legislation anymore. That seems like kind of a good example of where you did get that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think you had the sort of the set of financial incentives that occurred in the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then you have coming right on its heels, you have a bipartisan piece of legislation, Republicans and Democrats working together on really kind of a substantive change to the way that we're approaching our regulation of nuclear technology. And I think that You can go back decades and sort of all the time since we'll say 3 Mile Island at the end of the 1970s. I think you obviously a number of different laws and regulatory statutes and precedents created within the agency. But underneath of it all was this notion that the safest nuclear plant is the one that doesn't get built,
Right.
and so there was always that that challenge, that challenge of having to justify your existence, that increased timelines that maybe made small technical issues larger than perhaps what they should have been, and maybe you went to a place where you were really focused on compliance instead of looking at like a holistic risk informed approach to regulating these. And I think what you see in the Advance Act, I mean, you can look at it a number of different ways. I think you can look at it as a Swiss Army knife of new authorities that a motivated leadership can use to improve the way that it operates. But I think you can also look at it as this bipartisan acknowledgement that nuclear is absolutely necessary for our future growth and affluence as a country, right? That you need that energy source available to support where we want to go as a country in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And with all the sort of the great powers competition we have, and the need to kind of support continued affluence and development here at home. And so it's an acknowledgement that we need this, right? In a very similar way that you know we need the U.S. air travel system to be the country that we are, right?
Mhm.
And yes, the safest plane is the plane that doesn't fly, but we have an obligation to provide this service and benefit to the country, and we have to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a increasing realization in a lot of areas that it's possible that we have overshot in legal and regulatory policy sense the minimizing risk. I know this is a something that my colleagues here at CEI have worked on for many years, decades going back, in a case like with the Food and Drug Administration, for example. So uh, in that case, the safest drug is one that's never approved, right?
Mhm.
But of course, if we never approve any new drugs, we never have any new drugs to save anyone's life either. So there is, on one level, there's a continual recalibration of those things, right?
Mhm.
Because each administration has new directors and secretaries and administrators, and their leadership kind of redirects and points their agencies in slightly different directions as time goes on. And then they have the act, the substantive regulations that come out, and the sort of black letter law that gets modified over time. Um, and it certainly seemed that when it comes to uh, power generation in general across the board, we are in a maybe we should allow more stuff to get built faster era of
Right.
uh, NEPA reform, permitting reform, streamlining things, and certainly with nuclear. And so I just want to bring us up to, so we've had BIL, we've had uh, the Inflation Reduction Act, we've had the Advance Act, and then now we have, under the second Trump administration, we've had some executive orders that came out earlier this year. So we had a sort of a small raft of those. And real quick, we've had titles like Deploying Advanced Nuclear Reactor Technologies for National Security, Ordering the Reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Reforming Nuclear Reactor Testing at the Department of Energy, and Reinvigorating the Nuclear Industrial Base.
Mhm.
So those executive orders from earlier this year, they include some pretty bold goals. So, like the second of those said that the administration wants to quadruple U.S. nuclear energy capacity in by 2050. And that obviously would be huge. We haven't had that much time since then to sort of digest all of those policy goals and directional changes yet. But how significant do you think those executive orders are going to end up being? Because again, one thing we always hear We heard this during the Obama administration when Obama said, well, if Congress doesn't act, I have a pen and a phone, right? We know it now, where things are usually more durable and they've got more oomph to them if you get Congress to vote for it than if you get an executive order that says it. But certain things, do require, executive direction in that form. So is there enough in those executive orders you think to really push stuff forward?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's unlike anything, excuse me, that we've ever seen, that we've ever seen before, right? The combination, I will sort of take the sort of the holistic impact of all four of those executive orders was essentially to put the entire US government on a front foot orientation when it came to developing nuclear. Now, you know, there's a lot to unpack in those executive orders. There are a lot of reports, there are a lot of regulatory changes. And the point that you make is a good one, right? I mean, I think you have to have you have to have a combination of both an active intention and orientation of an administration that plays out in a way that doesn't allow the political pendulum to become a wrecking ball, right? Where, it
Mhm.
starts swinging so wildly that nothing ever gets done because the markets can't, count on any kind of policy certainty. And so, it's the combination of those two things. That's really how you stick the landing here. I think we have a detailed breakdown and review of the executive orders, and I would say for the most part, it's been acknowledging these executive orders are acknowledging issues that have been around for a while and have essentially stated an administrative position on those. So I think, I think most people in the industry would say that the executive orders on balance are a positive step, right? But there's a lot in the implementation that you got to get right so that you avoid that kind of wrecking ball scenario where you're swinging wildly between different administrations and different majorities in Congress. And again, because we have that sort of strong base of bipartisan basis of support for nuclear, that's been hard won, and we don't want to lose that. But I think it does give us a little bit more of a cushion than, say, some of the other issues where the choices are very black and white between the parties, and you're going to be flipping back and forth. So I think it's a really good positive first step. There's still a lot to play here. There's a lot for the agencies to do, and there's a lot of water left to go under the bridge.
Right. And I know that sometimes it can be a bit of a uh an ironic windfall if your industry ends up becoming the target of legislative focus, right? Because if, say, a majority in Congress decides, oh, we want to really like encourage this industry because we think they're strategically helpful, they might also at the same time come up with a long list of mandates that they think you should be fulfilling that maybe you might not have chosen for yourself. I'm thinking a little bit about the Chips and Science Act where Congress said, "Oh, well, we want to incentivize domestic microchip manufacturing, for example," but at the same time, the Department of Commerce under the Biden administration said, "Oh, but we also want to make sure we have gender equity requirements. We want to make sure that there are." On-site daycares built on any new microchip fab and things that were arguably not necessarily connected to the main point of the law to begin with, and so you know, it could be a sort of, I don't know, golden handcuffs or whatever
Mm-hmm.
the analogy you want to use to become the sort of darling of policymakers. Because I'm looking at like the one big beautiful bill, right? Had got rid of some of energy subsidies for other forms for like wind and solar and hydrogen, I believe, but for nuclear, there was sort of some additional like national security considerations saying that nuclear companies have to be more worried about being subject to or related to foreign entities I guess that's generally the idea that like, oh, well, we don't want corporate partners that are tied to the Chinese government or the Russians or whoever, whoever it might be. Um, so I wonder, and again, a lot of those, considerations are legitimate things to worry about, but I wonder if it's possible sometimes that Congress or the federal government kind of gives with one hand and then takes back with another when it comes to the requirements you have to fulfill.
Right. Yeah. And look, I think that I recognize the point, and I think in any situation like this, on the one hand, your goal is to have a smooth ship hull, but invariably you're gonna there are gonna be these barnacles on it, right? And that other requirements that aren't necessarily central to what you're trying to do. And I think ultimately, um, there is a there is a there's an arc to all of this that I go back to this notion of the federal government has really spent the better part of the last decade putting a firm hand on the bicycle seat with the nuclear industry on it and giving it a push. And but at some point, you have to let go, right? And I think that as I look at the development of the nuclear industry, if the government was simply to really maintain the commitments that it has now without then yes, you can always argue that a risk reduction program or something that incentivizes the first movers of new plants will get things moving that much faster. But even without it, nuclear is at a point where it is going to it's going to be riding, right? Like it's going to be off and on its own thing. So I'm not too worried about that. I think again, I think it's about consistency of policy over time. It's improving policy for certain, and there are a lot of things in the executive orders that would I think in the view of our members improve the policy. But at some point nuclear has to ride on its own, and it will. And I think that's the difference between now and 10 or even 5 years ago, is that you see these large the hyperscalers, you have large end users like Dow Chemical are beginning to kind of just look at their future and recognize they need to invest in this, that they need to be on board. And so I think we're getting to that point where the hand may not be off the bicycle seat just yet, but it's the momentum is there. There may be one more push, but nuclear is going to be on its way soon.
Well, yeah, I think one of the most kind of exciting aspects about this, for me when I read about it and kind of changes in the maybe perception of the industry is how the future of nuclear seems to be bound up with AI, the future of artificial intelligence supercomputing applications, which is probably not what most people would have associated with the industry even 5 years ago. So you have all these mega cap tech firms that are looking, potentially to buy as much new energy as possible for data centers,
Mm-hmm.
and especially low carbon energy. That's something that some of the biggest tech firms have already made long-term commitments, public commitments to, over the past several years. And that it seems like those requirements are only going to scale up going forward. Um, and and nuclear again as sort of like base load and low carbon seems pretty well situated to meet that need going forward. Um, and to me, it's sort of a shift where certainly when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, the nuclear industry had a definite sort of like it was sort of a Cold War industrial behemoth, right? It was big, it was expensive, it was safe, but it was sort of like giant piles of concrete and steel, whereas the idea of like being part of the AI revolution makes it seem sort of cutting edge, very futuristic, almost the optimistic way people thought about civilian nuclear power in the 1950s, right?
Right.
Where there was a lot of techno optimism at the time, or what my friend Jim Bethkukis calls upwing thinking rather than left wing or right
Mm-hmm.
wing. Um, are you spending a lot of time hanging out with Sam Altman and Sundar Pichai these days?
So it's fascinating because I can think about just 5 years ago, the level of interaction between the tech community and the nuclear industry wasn't nearly what it is now, right? The closeness of the relationship, the partnerships that are forming. I think I want to go back to something you said before, because I think it's the right way to look at this. So I came into the nuclear industry, or I came to the nuclear industry, or the nuclear issue, as a young congressional staffer back in the 1990s. Worked for a member that was on the appropriations committee and worked on the energy and water subcommittee. And if I think about what you know what nuclear looked like then, it was really I think if you had to boil it down to two words, it was orderly closure, right? Let's use these plants until the end of their lifetimes, and let's make sure we've got a way to manage the waste, and then we're going to move on. Um, I think if you would look at it in 2005, um, we had no idea of the revolution that hydraulic fracturing was going to bring to our energy supply and electricity
Right.
supply. And I'd also say that if you look at 2005 and 2022, and you draw a line between the two of them, we were using the same number of electrons each year, roughly. So we've been through 20 years of essentially zero electricity demand growth, and that's not upwing thinking, right? That's sort of, how do I manage what I have, because I'm not quite sure what the future looks like. Um, but just in the last few years, and it's really been in the last 5 years, we've been through this tectonic shift where we're now looking at, electricity demand growth rates in, two, sometimes three, and some faster growing areas of the country, 4% a year growth. It changes everybody's calculus in terms of what they need. And so I think that, hyperscalers are part of it. And definitely you see that as being a contributor to the upward demand curve coming in the next 10 years. Most recently, it's been onshoring of energy intensive manufacturing that's
Mm-hmm.
really been driving the industrial electricity demand growth in the U.S. So it's a combination of a number of things. I think the hyperscalers get a lot of the press because it's AI and it's a national competition, and we all have different feelings about AI, but number of underlying factors driving that significant demand growth, and nuclear is if you're going to meet that demand growth in a way that um, maintains some price, where the electricity prices, wholesale and retail electricity prices, don't go through the roof as they kind of seem like they're doing now. You need a diversified portfolio, you need a strong base load, and nuclear gives you that. So we're kind of the right solution at the right time.
Yeah, I wonder if you could also talk for a minute about how big this industry is. And I'm thinking back to, again, the sort of kind of older, sort of, at least my older view of the industry, which is that you had a few regulated utilities, which is, they're stable, not the most entrepreneurial businesses in the world, for obvious reasons. And then you had a couple of the industrial giants that were known for making uh, parts of reactors and replacement parts, like Westinghouse and GE, again, these kind of like Cold War era behemoths. But now you have startups, right? Like I've gone to conferences where there's like a whole startup pitch competition of these guys, and the idea that like people would be doing nuclear energy startups the way they do software startups, again, is something I feel like this is an artifact of the past few years. So you've got, but and still today you've got that kind of hierarchy, right? You've got Constellation and Exelon. You've still got, GE and Westinghouse are still out there. You got the guys doing the hard rock mining for uranium all around the world. Um, but then you also have some of the people I met when I was at ANS's conference a couple of years ago, the physicists and engineers who work at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos and Idaho National Labs. You got people who work at university departments, they're physicists and engineers all across the country. So that's a pretty heterogeneous group. Maybe too much to all be. Is that even one group?
Hmm.
In a
Yeah.
sense. Um, how do these people work together, or is it just it's the magic of the invisible hand? They don't have to consciously work together. They just kind of complement each other.
Right. Well, yeah, look, I think the way, if we're going to bucketize the nuclear industry, I think you've got it. I think you've got it right in total that you have, essentially 94 operating reactors in the United States right now. Those are all light water reactors, existing technology. The workforce required to support that, it all depends on how you count, but let's maybe start. The core group is roughly, I don't know, call it 100 to 150,000 people, and then you have sort of the secondary economic impact of it from there. Most of those reactors, except for a few that a couple that were brought online last year in Georgia, are all you know 20, 30, 40, and sometimes older year plants, right? So there's sort of, if you think about a lovingly maintained early 1970s Grand Torino, that runs like the day that it did when it ran off the shop. And oh, by the way, it's probably more of a resto mod too, because we've replaced components and so forth. But that industry is lovingly devoted to maintaining that set of assets, and they do it at a capacity factor of 92, 93%. So
Right.
93% of the time it's up and running. So it's really an amazing feat, and they've done it at a time when there were a lot of people that didn't like nuclear. Nuclear was not, was kind of the stepchild of the energy scene for a number of decades, and then people have finally realized the value that it has. So you have that, right? And that really requires operational excellence. It's not There's not a lot of innovation that you need. I mean, yes, there's innovation in the way that you maintain things and the way that you replace components and do uprates and that sort of thing. But then, there was this group of, and it's a generational difference too, right? Of young people that came up through nuclear engineering programs at US universities that were, people that I knew from the time that they were students, presenting in poster sessions at the student
Mhm.
conference. And now they're I mean, if you were some of them's net worths are start with a B, right? So it's but I think they reimagined the way nuclear could be. They took a lot from the early pioneers in the late 50s and early 60s. A lot of the reactor designs that they're working on now were designs that were pioneered back in that time but just never pursued, right? We were in what I've heard somebody say was the QWERTY keyboard of light water reactors, right? Like
Hmm.
once you build an industry cluster around that and a supply chain, then it's kind of hard to think about doing something different. And that was obviously driven in part by, in no small part by, the naval, the naval nuclear program. So a lot of naval nuclear, a lot of ex-naval nuclear people in the utility industry today, and it really is amazing. But these young folks have reimagined the use case for nuclear, right? They've looked at these technologies, and they're um, whether it's remote locations or process heat or long refueling intervals, they've kind of said, look, we can do this differently. We can, a pressurized water reactor needs 2200 psi or so to operate, right? Where, we can create systems that operate at psi that are elevated, but elevated more like a truck tire or something than
Right.
so there are different ways of doing it where you can improve the safety, you can create more simplicity, but you have to prove it, right? You have to build those systems. You have to create a supply chain around you to develop engineering scale demonstrations, and then some people want to go directly to NRC regulated plants. Others want to iterate and build larger plants and gain from their operational experience. So and I think that that interaction with Silicon Valley and the innovation culture of the West has imbued this new advanced nuclear community with a lot of tools to succeed in the way that the old line businesses just couldn't, because they were, their heads were wrapped around an entirely different problem. So it's nice to have both. It's fun to watch them interact with each other sometimes, but they're all under our tent.
But yeah, I'm waiting to see, more and more kind of new technologies and new applications roll out. Precisely like you said, some of them that were sort of revived proposals or technologies of previous eras that didn't get pursued. I was visiting Savannah, Georgia, a couple summers ago, and there was a little historical marker there to the NS Savannah, which is apparently the first and, as far as I knew, only nuclear powered civilian cargo ship. Right, like you mentioned, the naval engineers who obviously the Navy has plenty of nuclear powered vessels, but it was as far as I know, the only ever nuclear powered cargo ship, and I think the Panama Canal should be all nuclear powered cargo ships. Send them out around the world.
It's so actually it's dry docked in Baltimore, and they still do periodic tours of the old NS Savannah. But it does show you how, how the attitudes were different back in that time. But again, what's old is new again. There is a new discussion about how do you use advanced nuclear technology for commercial marine propulsion, right? I've heard uh, people in the nautical world talk about it as 30 for 30, right? 30 knots for 30 years. That's what you get in a naval ship. And obviously commercial systems are going to be different, but it does, you have an environment where um, the maritime industry is very used to making large capital investments with long payoff times. It's the kind of industry that can, understand and wrap their heads around the attributes of nuclear, because nuclear is not easy, right? It's not, it's not as it's not as easy as diesel by a long shot, but it does allow you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't do. So that too, even we're seeing that as coming back, and I think it's really a larger issue of people. Nuclear can be scary to a lot of people if you don't know a lot about it. The more you learn about it, the easier it is to love. And most of the people that are in our industry came to it because they maybe tripped into it working on something else, or but they fell into it. They went through a journey, and now they love nuclear, right? So again, ANS, we're not an advocacy organization. We're kind of we're scientific and professional. But that doesn't mean we don't have 12,000 enthusiasts that can see ways in which nuclear technology can help people better their lives, save their lives in some cases, and create that world of abundance that we all want, that allows us to have a peaceful, prosperous existence, whether it's as a country or a world. So the more I work in this industry today, the more I think that nuclear, in many ways, our embrace of nuclear is more of a analogous to our choice about where we see what we think future civilization should look like, right? Is it Star Trek, or is it Planet of the Apes, right? I mean, you kind of have to, and everything in between, and nuclear definitely falls on you know that more optimistic institution-based future, as opposed to it's the least dystopian choice ultimately.
I like that. I think that's a great summary. Well, Craig, thank you so much for being with us. This has been an excellent conversation, and hopefully we'll have more landmark public policy victories going going forward. We can bring you back to talk about sometime. But before we go, tell everyone where we can find all of ANS's excellent work.
And that would be at ans.org. So I encourage everybody to take a look. Richard, really appreciate the time.
All right. Thanks again.